In this tutorial, I'll show you my favourite techniques for drawing fur in pastels. I'm Kirsty Rebecca and I make drawing and painting tutorials that are easy to follow even if you're just starting out. For this piece, I'm working on Clairefontaine Pastel Mat, which is my favourite paper to work on with pastels, and I've cut my sheet down to 4.5 by 4.5 inches roughly. I've drawn my outline using a pastel pencil, and I would not recommend using a graphite pencil or transfer paper that is graphite based because it can be harder to go on top with pastels because the graphite's kind of a slippery surface. So I'm working with pan pastels for the base layer, and if you don't know what they are, they're basically a soft pastel that's been compressed into a pan, and you apply them with soft tools, and that's spelled SOFFT, that's the brand of the tool. And these tools come in different shapes and sizes that you can use to apply your pastels to your paper. I'm starting by blocking in the dark stripes first, and I'm just taking some blues and blacks and adding them to the black stripes. You want to make sure that you aren't just using black in the dark areas because it can look quite flat like that. Some artists are against using black at all, but I find that if you mix it or layer it with other colours, and then it works quite well. When I do a base layer, I'm basically filling in the different sections with darker mid-tone colours. So I'm not using the darkest black that you can see in the reference photo, but definitely not the lightest colour that you see either. You want to be able to add in your darkest values and your lightest values when you do your detail layers on top. So this layer is just a good base to work on top of. Then I move on to the lightest areas, which are the white parts of the fur. When drawing white or black fur, just remember that both white and black really reflect the colours that are around it, so it's never just white or just black. So I'm paying attention to where the cooler colours like the blues are and the warmer colours like the yellows and reds and creams are, and I'm adding some of those colours in those areas as well. Pan pastels are a fantastic way of working with pastels because it's far less messy than working with traditional soft pastel sticks. You don't even have to touch the pastel at all because you apply it with the sponges and the tools, and then when you're working with pastel pencils on top, you don't even have to touch pastel throughout the entire process. And that's one of the reasons why people don't like working with pastels, because they don't like the feel of it on their hands. But if you use those two supplies, then you don't really need to touch it at all. Pan pastels also blend really easily together, which means that you can start out with just 5 pans, a red, a blue, a yellow, a black, and a white, and you can mix any colour you need with those 5 colours. So you don't really need a huge set to start with if you just want to try them out. I actually have a video that shows you how you can mix those 5 colours together, and I've also got 2 little landscapes that you can create at the end of that video, so I'll leave a link in the description if you wanted to check it out. Moving on to the orange section of the fur, I'm not using just one bright orange. I'm mixing some browns and some reds and some oranges together to give it some variation. Again, I'm paying attention to where the shadow areas are as well. And when you're drawing fur, make sure that you are following the direction of the fur at all the stages of your process, including the base layer, right up until you do the detail layer as well, because you don't want some of the strokes going in the wrong direction because it might show through in the end and not look natural. I'm also blocking in the main colour of the iris area, and I'm not adding in the details on this layer in the eye area because the tools are a little bit too big for that, so I'll leave it for the pastel pencils in the next few layers. So I'm blending out my pastel with a cotton tip, and you could use a blending stump if you prefer, but this basically pushes the pastel into the paper, which smooths out the colours, helps you be able to add more layers on top, and it also helps stop some of that dust falling off as well. Before I show you how to get the details, if you want to follow along with my longer real-time tutorials where I talk you through every step of the process, then Patreon might be the solution for you. For a small amount per month, you'll have access to every tutorial that I've previously uploaded on your chosen tier level in a variety of mediums like pastel, coloured pencil, graphite, watercolour and more. You will also have access to the original reference photo, a traceable outline, and a list of supplies that I'm using, so you really can follow along every step of the way. My tutorials don't skip any stages or cut out any important parts of the process, and I will share all of my secrets to help you improve. Every month, I will upload brand new tutorials to the library so you can grow and develop your drawing and painting skills and take your art to the next level. You can also join in on our members chat group where you can ask questions or advice or share your artwork and talk to other members in the Patreon community. The link is in the description if you want to check it out. I'm using Faber-Castell Pitt pastels, but you can use whatever pastels you have. I also like the Stabilo Carbothello or the Derwent pastels. Those are both good choices if you have either of those. And this layer is all about adding texture. I'm not too worried about the color at this point because I'll be glazing other colors and adding another layer on top as well. So I'm coming in with the white first, adding fur detail all over the white areas and the orange areas. And I'm making sure that I'm varying my strokes so they're not all lined up like a picket fence. So you want to make sure that your pencil strokes stop and start at different points and some curve slightly differently, but also make sure that they're the right length and going in the right direction. You don't want all of the strokes to be exactly the same because it doesn't look natural that way. You want them to be slightly different. You don't want to put long strokes where the fur is short because it will look like it has long fur in that area if you do long strokes with your pencil. Then I'm doing the same with the black pencil in the black areas. If you work with pan pastels in a combination with pastel pencils on this Clairefontaine pastel matte surface, there's also not a lot of pastel dust fall off in comparison to working with soft pastel sticks. So it's less messy and it's also easier for framing and storing because there's less of that dust that comes off. I like to work on a toned paper, usually a mid-tone brown or grey, because I find it much easier to work that way. Because if you start out with a white surface, you obviously can't add white on top of that, so you kind of have to work around the lighter areas and it makes it a little bit harder than it needs to be. Instead, you can just work on a mid-tone colour and go straight in with darker colours or lighter colours. It just makes it a lot easier and you don't have to fight with the white grain of the paper showing through either. If any of the paper shows through with the mid-tone colours, it won't be as obvious as the white would be if it shows through. So I've added a little bit of a lighter blue to some of the fur where I can see a bit more of that blue tone, and then I went into the eye area and added some of those textures and details on the iris as well. So I'm blending this layer with my finger, and the reason that I'm doing that instead of using a cotton tip this time is because it's a softer, less harsh way of blending than using a cotton tip, and it will let some of that fur texture show through in the next layer, so it doesn't quite push it into the paper as much as the cotton tip does. It just helps soften out some of the graininess. Then I'm just repeating the process, adding in some more colours like blues, browns, reds and creams depending on what I see in the reference photo, and making sure to blend between each layer as well. And just keep going until you get your values right, so make sure that your shadows are dark enough and your highlights are light enough. And I say this all the time, but values are the most important thing when it comes to realism. So having that contrast will really make your drawing pop, so don't be afraid to get those shadows in there as well. Some people struggle to get the amount of layers that they need to create this kind of depth in their fur, and the main 3 tips that I have for you are to use the right surface, so use Clairefontaine pastel matte or a sanded paper. These papers will let you add so many more layers in comparison to a generic paper that's labelled as pastel paper. Not all papers are created equally, and the generic papers that are labelled as pastel paper tend to look really grainy and they don't take as many layers. The paper is probably the most important part because you won't get the same effect on most papers, unfortunately, but the Clairefontaine pastel matte is a great paper to use. The second tip is to make sure that you're blending between each layer. Like I was saying earlier, you need to push that pigment into the tooth of the paper so that it allows for the paper to still grab onto the next layer of pastel, rather than having that dust sit there and fill up the little grooves of your paper. The third tip is to not have too many layers of pastel down. And although pastel matte lets you add more layers than most papers, there will still be a limit to how much pastel you can add. So with your base layer especially, try and be very light with that, but every layer that you do, don't add too much pastel, just be sparing with the amount of pastel that you use. I usually do a light base layer with the pan pastels, a texture layer, and then 1 to 3 detail layers depending on what kind of subject I'm doing and how much pastel I add. So that gives you a good idea of how much you can actually add to your paper, but you need to make sure that you're doing light layers as you go and blending it. When it comes to sharpening your pastel pencils, you need to be aware that they won't go as sharp as coloured pencils will. They can actually be sharpened to a fine point with a sharpener, but they do tend to crumble or wear down extremely quickly. If you try and keep a sharp point on your pencil throughout the entire project, you'll end up wasting away a lot of your pencil. I just sharpen away the wooden casing on mine with a Stanley knife or a craft knife and then use it like that. And to keep your pencil a little bit sharper for longer, you can rotate your pencil in your hand as you draw every few strokes, and that will keep the point a little bit sharper. The only time I actually sharpen the pencil to a fine point is if I'm signing the piece or maybe doing whiskers on a small subject. On most of my subjects, I don't even sharpen my pencil to a really fine point for the whiskers. I just kind of use the side of the pencil, and you can do it like that. But if you did need a really fine point, you can use some sandpaper that you can buy from the art shop, or you can just get one from a hardware store, and I just sharpen the tip until I get as fine a point as I need. You just got to keep in mind that it won't go as sharp as a coloured pencil, and if it does, it will probably break. You can use a manual crank handle sharpener, but the blades get dull quite quickly and you'll have to replace them pretty often. If you can get replacement blades in your country for a reasonable price, then I would recommend the Derwent Superpoint or the Swordfish manual crank handle sharpeners. They actually do work quite well, but the cost of replacing the blades just isn't worth it for me because I can't get access to reasonably priced ones in Australia. You can also run a woodless graphite pencil through the manual crank handle sharpeners to keep them sharper for longer. But honestly, sharpening it with a craft knife or a Stanley knife is the way that I do it for pretty much every piece. It gets a point that is fine enough to get all the details that I need, and people say that it takes too long to do that, but honestly, I sharpen my pastels that I'm going to use at the beginning of my project, and then I don't have to sharpen them again for the entire project most of the time. So it really doesn't take that much time. And I've got a bonus tip if you're struggling to get those last highlights or the deep shadows in your final layer. You can actually try using a softer pastel pencil like the Caran d'Ache pastel pencils. They're much softer than the Derwent, the Faber-Castell or the Carbothello, but they do crumble really easily because they're so soft. They are also much more expensive, so I only have a few that I use for this reason. They go on top of layers of pastel a little bit easier than the other pencils do. So if you get really stuck and you need a bright highlight, you can try one of those because they do work quite well. There's a real-time version of this drawing where I talk you through the entire process on my Patreon channel, so I'll leave that link in the description. But on the screen there's a playlist of some other pastel tutorials that I thought you might find useful, so click on that and I'll see you over there.